Well, it's a great pleasure to be giving this talk. It's not as great a pleasure as it was going to have been because, of course, I was supposed to be in Auckland this week giving a similar talk. But COVID got in the way of that. But it is delightful to be able to share my ideas. And I'm planning to come back in a year's time. So you'll be able to see me in the flesh if you want to ask me any more questions. And today I'm going to look back over a few thousand years of behaviors, policies, attitudes, and show how drug policies have evolved in a rather unsatisfactory way, and give you some pointers at the end to where we might make improvements. And this is an image of me taken about 11 years ago, drawn about 11 years ago now, when I was sacked from my post as the government's chief drugs advisor, and I was sacked essentially for saying that drugs like cannabis were less harmful than drugs like alcohol and cigarettes, and that went down very badly with a government that was getting a lot of money from the drinks industry in particular. And after the sacking, a friend of mine helpfully sent me this quote from Voltaire: "It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong." And that's actually an aphorism that I guess a lot of more mature and wise government advisors know in advance. But I found out the hard way. However, it did propel me into some kind of spotlight from which I was able to carry on a very public debate about drugs. What was remarkable about that particular incident of my sacking was that the same week, Andre Agassi published his autobiography, and he sold it not on the grounds of being a great tennis player, but on the grounds of having lied about taking crystal meth. And that kind of rather sums up the ambivalence that society has about drugs. If you tell the truth that you've lied about taking drugs, you can sell a lot more copies of your autobiography. But if you tell the truth about drugs, you get sacked. Now, over the last 10 years, having set up the charity Drug Science, I've done a lot of thinking about the current national and international criminal-based, punishment-based policies on drugs. And there are 7 reasons why these are flawed, and they're listed on this slide. They're biased against the drugs, because drugs that are more harmful than some are not controlled. They're derived and directed by political rather than health concerns. They put punishment above harm reduction, which is a moral choice. The punishments in many countries are disproportionate to harms and do more harm than good. And let's remember that there are still plenty of countries around the world which execute people for drug use. They severely limit treatment and research. They encourage the use of more toxic compounds, and they waste a vast amount of money. And I'm going to take you through most of these in the course of my talk. But I want to start with this remarkable statement, which is in red at the top here. This list is a list of the worst excesses of the current international drug laws under the UN conventions. And in many countries, opioids for pain control are not allowed. In fact, the majority of the world's population is denied them, simply because governments find it easier to comply with the UN conventions by banning access to opiates than regulating them. And here is the latest UN data, came out a few months ago, and the dark area, the brown areas and the red areas are countries in the world where essentially there is inadequate or severely inadequate access of opioids for pain. And that has 2 consequences. The first is that millions of people around the world suffer pain unnecessarily because they can't get medication. And secondly, many of them turn to the black market to get treatment for their pain because they can't get them legally, because their countries deny access. And that is one of the great medical anomalies and controversies in the world today. And of course, it's driven by this belief that prohibition will somehow protect the world from harm. And the reality is that we have known for as long as there have been international drug laws, which goes back really to the Hague Convention in about 1910, that prohibition leads to the use of more harmful drugs. And here are a number of examples, and I don't want to go through them all. I can give you much more details on any of them if you want. But I want to focus on the bottom one in red. And the last decade, we have seen this peculiar American problem of OxyContin overprescribing and the reaction to it, which has led to people switching to more toxic substances, particularly heroin and fentanyls. And the next slide shows a truly remarkable picture. These are the number of deaths from opioids each year in the USA. And if you look at the top line, the green line, which is any opioid, you see there's a massive increase in deaths from about 2013. Why is that? Well, that is because there was concern about this rising level of deaths from opioids before 2013. And here, there was an attempt made to restrict the availability of OxyContin and other semi-synthetic opioids in an attempt to reduce the number of deaths. But that was a precipitate move which led to a lot of people having their medication terminated. And terminating access to opioids leads to withdrawal and to a lot more pain. So what do those patients do who couldn't get their prescriptions? They turn to other opioids which they could get. And this is particularly interesting. They turn to heroin. Up to that point, to about 2010, heroin deaths have been relatively stable. And they've been mostly in people who use heroin for non-medical purposes, heroin addicts. But then people in pain turned to heroin and started dying. And what's interesting about that is that heroin has been illegal in America as a medicine since 1948. And yet when people need pain control, they were able to get it, and many more died. So that is perhaps one of the most graphic recent examples of how prohibition actually has no effect on recreational use, massively increases the harms through diversion of more dangerous drugs. And it also is an example of how we need policies relating to opioids need to be much more nuanced and much more balanced in terms of the benefit-risk ratio. That was the USA. Let's look what happened in Britain over a similar time period. And here we say go back from 1994 to 2018, and you can see the top blue line, total number of deaths from opioids, and it's reached an all-time high. In fact, the last 2 years, each year has been an all-time high for opioid deaths in Britain. And that's not because we have stopped people prescribing painkillers. That's because we have stopped treating people who are dependent on opioids. And the red line there is the same time over which the Portuguese experiment took place. And as I'll talk later, over that period of 15 years, the Portuguese approach, which is essentially a humane approach, treating opioid drug users humanely with appropriate treatments rather than criminalizing them, has led to a 2/3 reduction in opioid deaths. And you can see in the UK, we've seen almost a 3-fold increase in opioid deaths in the last 30 years. So we're getting it wrong in the UK as well as in the USA. And many other banned drugs, not just opioids, have utility as treatments. So cannabis has growing evidence in a whole range of disorders, particularly pain, spasticity, sleep, etc. Ecstasy has got good trial data now in PTSD and has been used in Parkinson's disease. Psilocybin for depression, OCD, cluster headaches. LSD for terminal illnesses and addiction. And even methadone for depression and addiction. So these are drugs which are all illegal. Research on them is very, very difficult, and so there's very little of it. But it's very promising. But the reality is that the current regulations make it very, very difficult to research these. And one of the reasons that people say we don't have enough evidence about medical cannabis is because medical cannabis research has been intensely stifled by the UN conventions. This slide looks at psychedelic research, going back from the beginnings of the discovery of LSD here to the present day. And this slide looks at the first 20 years. And you can see year on year the number of publications relating to LSD in blue and psilocybin in pink rose. LSD in the 1950s and 60s was seen as the great revolution in psychiatry. But it was also legal, and it was used by two of the leading scientists of that century, two of probably the most important Nobel prizes in medicine. The Crick and Watson Nobel Prize, here's Crick, and here's Kerry Mullis. And as you know, Crick with Watson worked out the structure of DNA. And then after taking LSD, he decided that was a relatively trivial problem. And he tried to work out how his mind worked. And Kerry Mullis was struggling to work out how to get enough of this DNA to do proper analysis on. And as he said, his Nobel Prize came because he saw how what he needed to do was unravel the two helices of the DNA molecule. And he saw that unraveling like a serpent uncoiling and repeatedly replicating itself under an LSD trip. I'll just remind you that all the testing that's going to be done now in COVID-19, it largely relies on the PCR technique that Mullis saw as a result of taking LSD. But that was when it was legal, and then it was made illegal. In 1971, under the UN Psychotropics Convention, it was banned, and that ban essentially led to an almost extinction of research on LSD and psilocybin, and there were two reasons for that. The first is that it became extremely difficult to get the drug to work with because it was illegal and deemed very dangerous. And secondly, governments wouldn't fund the research because they believed that funding this research was somehow giving credence to the idea that it wasn't as harmful as government said it was. Up to this arrow here, the US government had funded nearly 140 separate studies on LSD, and since then it's funded none. And the same happened with cannabis. Cannabis research was taking up a real rise in the late 1960s, and the 71 Convention essentially strangled it for the next 30 years. And even today, in the USA, where 2/3 of the population have access to medical cannabis, and over 100 million people have access to recreational cannabis, it's still illegal to research by the using federal government funds because they still deem it a dangerous drug. And I would argue that this impediment to research, which was produced as a result of the UN conventions, is the worst censorship of research ever, or at least since 1616, when the Papal Congregation of the Index, that's the Catholic Church, banned all books advocating the writings of Copernicus. Copernicus had discovered that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that conflicted with Catholic teaching, and so they banned his writings. They burnt the monk Bruno at the stake because he preached Copernicus' theory of the universe. And they offered Galileo the same choice, and he sensibly declined. That ban lasted 150 years, but only it was effective in Catholic countries. The Northern European Protestant countries continued to research the heavens using their telescopes. The ban on psychedelics, and to some extent cannabis, has lasted 50 years. And it's been ratified by every country in the world. There is no country in the world where LSD is legal or synthetic psilocybin is legal. And of course, the number of researchers who would be interested in using these drugs in the last 50 years is infinitely greater than the number of astronomers back in the 1600s. If you want to read more about it, here are a couple of reviews that I've put out in the last 10 years that explain the problems, the origins, and the impediments. And I just want to tell you a little anecdote, how the government regulations are so oppressive. They terrify scientists to stand up to them. So when I was asked to write this review in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, I was asked to have an American author because, of course, America is the largest site of neuroscience researchers. And I approached a senior American scientist and said, would you like to co-author this review with me? This is a really important chance to lay out a challenge to change the regulations. And he said, if I did, David, I would never get another NIDA grant. Because to oppose the main funder of drugs in America, which is NIDA, would be career suicide. And that reflects the fact that almost all the funding of government agencies, particularly NIDA in the States, but to some extent in the UK as well, the funding is all about finding problems with drugs. It's all about justifying the status quo rather than finding out the real truth. So let's look at now as to why drugs are so terrifying to current Western culture. And the first thing to say is that they go back a long way. Drugs have been around for a very long time. And here are a whole range of different psychedelics that have been used in different parts of the world. These drugs are almost the norm for society. It's really only Western society that's trying to eliminate them. And we will come on to why that might be in a minute. Here's Amanita muscaris, the mushroom preferred in Northern Europe and Siberia. And here's a nice little Roman mosaic showing the manufacture of Amanita tea a couple of thousand years ago. But the most interesting picture here is this one. This is a Greek noble person taking part in the Eleusinian mysteries. And they were festivals which occurred every year when the cereal crop, the rye, started to grow this fungus called ergot. And the Greeks discovered that mixing ergot, which is a psychedelic, a weak LSD, with alcohol made a very powerful combination. And it was the source of their Eleusinian mysteries. These were massive parties which took place for a couple of weeks out in the countryside. And the ancient Greeks used those mysteries to help them understand the state of their minds and also to reflect on where their society was going. And after these mysteries, they returned back to their city-states. And they did what ancient Greeks were rather good at doing, which is like inventing geometry and literature and theatre and music. And, of course, these magnificent paintings on vases. And it's a perfectly reasonable point to suggest that, in fact, the whole of Western culture has emerged as a result of the insights that the ancient Greeks got from this psychedelic alcohol cocktail. This is an ornamental vase. It was used for drinking the cocktail, the kykeon. And on the right-hand side is a rather nice book that some of you might want to read about how Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD was seen by many people in that time, in the 50s and 60s, as a return to the Eleusinian fields. Well, it wasn't just Western culture or Western religion that was developed as a result of psychedelics. Hinduism also has its roots in drugs. And the drug cocktail at the time was called soma. And we don't exactly know what it was, but the best estimates are it's a combination of cannabis, psilocybin from magic mushrooms, and ephedra, which is a stimulant from the ephedra plant, which makes ephedrine. And Hindu teachings tell us that the god Shiva slept under a cannabis bush, and the drippings from that gave him the insights that made him what he was, a god. And whether it made him grow the extra arms, we're not sure. But cannabis has maintained its position as a religious cultural feature in India to the present day, and there are groups of individuals called sadhus who essentially are chronically intoxicated with cannabis as part of their religious behaviors. The Romans, of course, lowered the tone. They decided that power was more important than art, and that alcohol was the way to that. And they invented the bacchanalia. Here's a war relief from a Roman temple on the left, and here's a depiction of bacchanalia on the right by a French artist. And alcohol became the preferred drug of choice, and possibly because it does more adequately fit with the notion of power and conquest. Judaism took a rather different tone. Following the disgrace of Noah with his drunkenness, Jewish culture decided that alcohol was not a good thing. It had to be contained. And largely, Jews use alcohol in ceremonial purposes, particularly at weddings. And of course, on the right-hand side here, you see the very famous miracle of Jesus turning water into wine to facilitate the wedding at Cana. Interestingly, the early Christians turned away from alcohol too. And in the middle image here is a book by John Allegro, who is a philologist, a man who studied ancient Hebrew. And his book focuses on the evidence that the early Christians used Amanita muscaris as a way of bonding their small communities together and also communicating with their God. And there is evidence from later Christian art that this is true. Here is a rather beautiful motif, a fresco from Planocourt in France, showing actually that this is the Adam and Eve myth, and actually the tree was not an apple tree, but it was actually an Amanita muscaris mushroom. In fact, what Eve gave to Adam was not an apple, but the mushroom. And over here is a Canterbury Psalter, which is one of the great medieval descriptions of Christianity. And in the Psalter, on day 3, when God created earth and plants, what he actually created was magic mushrooms. In fact, the use of Amanita was known until about the 13th century, when the Catholic Church and the papacy became so powerful it was able to eliminate it. So when the Catholic Church became a business, it got rid of the ability of people just to go and pick their sacred objects from the ground, and they essentially gave the franchise to monks, and the franchise was the alcohol franchise, and that lasted for a very long time, and still there are plenty of monasteries who make their money from alcohol, largely in recent centuries, because in many countries they had a monopoly on distilling, and they weren't just brewers, but they were also the producers of spirits. And in our own country, as well as that, the British, a few centuries ago, as the empire was growing, the British worked out there was a lot of money to be made in drugs. In fact, the British Empire was probably the largest drug dealer the world has ever known. They took over the cannabis markets in India and forced the Indians to buy their cannabis rather than grow their own. And they forced the Chinese to buy opium, even though the Chinese didn't want to buy opium. And these are, of course, some of the most horrible examples of the oppressive colonialism there's ever been. And interestingly, though, there was some research done, particularly on the role of cannabis in India. This is the Indian Hemp Commission from 1893, which was the first systematic assessment of the harms of cannabis. And it was occasioned by political concern that cannabis was making people mentally ill. And they concluded that it wasn't. And I think that's a conclusion that we probably would still concur with today. So with all that money being made out of selling drugs and making drugs, where did prohibition start? Well, it really started with Islam. And it started with the Quran. And the rationale of the Quran was the banning of alcohol was in the Quran. And the rationale is to prevent inauthentic interactions with Allah. The argument goes that Muhammad could see that alcohol would allow people effectively to lie to God about their feelings and their trust in him. So alcohol was banned. And in fact, Islam has been relatively effective. It's relatively successfully banned alcohol and cannabis, but it wasn't so successful in banning coffee and tobacco. And of course, the reason is that alcohol and cannabis do change people's mental states. They're intoxicants, whereas coffee and tobacco are less obviously affect the user. You can pray effectively even though you've had a coffee or you've had a cigarette. But in the West, the use of products like cannabis became widely available in the 1800s. And this is a particularly interesting comment from William O'Shaughnessy, who was one of the importers of cannabis into his pharmacy in London. And it's on the preparations of the Indian hemp, or ganja, their effects on the animal system in health, and their utility in the treatment of tetanus and other convulsive diseases. So we knew then, back in the 1840s, that cannabis was useful for epilepsy. It also took away some of the pains, but not the fatality of tetanus. And that's perhaps why it was used by the most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria. We believe she used it for her gynecological pains, menstrual cramps, etc. And her physician, J. Russell Reynolds, wrote the definitive text on the therapeutic uses and toxic effects of cannabis indica in the Lancet in 1890. And in fact, cannabis was a legal medicine in the UK till 1971, when it was eventually banned as a result of enormous decades of pressure from the USA, who were determined to eliminate medical cannabis because they believed that eliminating medical cannabis would eliminate recreational use. Such a far-fetched concept. It's rather bizarre that it would ever be countenanced, but it was. But let's go back to the 1880s, or the 1800s, sorry. It wasn't just cannabis that was available. Mrs. Winslow was selling cocaine soothing syrup for children. Bayer were selling heroin. And even peyote was being sold. Park Davis and Company in Chicago were selling peyote snuff. So basically, in the 1800s, you could get almost any drug you wanted from your local pharmacy. And you could even get these polydrug products. The French decided to go the whole hog and make a cocktail of alcohol and cocaine, the Mariani wine, popular French tonic wine, which was even endorsed by the Pope. Pope Leo XIII apparently carried a hip flask of this around to give him strength and wisdom. And they gave the Mariani Company the Vatican Gold Medal for their wonderful cocktail. And the monks in Britain had a similar idea. Rather than add cocaine, which wasn't something that was easily available in Britain, they made their butt-fast wine and they spruced it up with lots of caffeine. And this is still made today. It's a tonic wine, and it certainly gives you energy as well as relaxes you. And here is an example of that combination being used in preparation for a fight in Scotland. It's a fighting elixir in Scotland. You drink a bottle of this, then you break the end off, and you go and do what you do in a fight. Not to be left behind, the US came up with cocaine cola. The original Coca-Cola had cocaine and cola in it. And by all accounts, it was rather impressive. You can see it was definitely a beverage for discriminating people. And it's interesting that the adverts rather focused on women. Cocaine was present in Coca-Cola till the 1920s. And what was particularly interesting was, of course, the person who needs the most energy on December the 25th was Santa. And Santa has become, even to this day now, associated with Coca-Cola. And what's interesting is it's the same, the Coca-Cola cap is the same color as the Santa outfit. And that can't be coincidence, can it? Of course, those are Northern Europeans' views of Santa, those Pacific Islanders that hopefully some of you are watching this now, and some of New Zealanders are aware of this, I'm sure, that kava was, when Santa was in the Pacific, he used kava to give him energy and drive rather than Coca-Cola. But the reality is, for those who know about drugs, it wasn't cocaine and it wasn't kava that Santa used. Santa used amanita. And the whole idea, the fantasy of the red-nosed reindeer is the fact that reindeers love amanita. And they find it, they eat it, and they eat it because it contains muscimol. And muscimol is a mood-enhancing product. It works on the GABA system. Here's a drawing of a Sami drinking the urine of a reindeer, because after the reindeer have eaten the amanita, they pee, and the muscimol comes out in the pee, and it gives heart and energy to the Sami who collect, if they can, collect it from the reindeer. And what's particularly interesting about muscimol is that the hallucinations are rather different from other mushrooms. It tends to produce what we call macropsia and micropsia. And I kind of feel that perhaps the idea that there's a hell of a big Santa and lots of tiny elves has got something to do with the use of amanita. But that's just my theory. Prohibition began to develop in earnest in the late 1800s in a response to the fact that drugs were available. And there were four drivers for this. The first were the Puritan temperance movements of the 1800s. They want to get rid of all drugs, including alcohol, and kind of succeeded in doing that by the 1920s. And then there was the Drug Enforcement Agency and the alcohol prohibition. There was political expediency and also competing commercial interests from the alcohol industry and from pharmaceuticals. So let's look at each of those. One of the things that happened in the 19th century with the rise of modern pharmaceuticals was that the patenting of minor derivatives of natural medicines. And here you see, here's the advertisement for Bayer Pharmaceuticals 100 odd years ago. And they're selling aspirin, which is a derivative of willow bark, but they put an extra acetyl group on it. Heroin, a derivative of opium, they put an extra acetyl group on it. And lysitol, which is just uric acid made synthetically. So the foundation of modern pharmaceuticals was the fact that companies could patent minor alterations of natural products. And in fact, the amphetamines were developed from ephedra as a treatment for asthma. And in the 20th century, we've seen THC and cannabidiol patented from the cannabis plant. So pharmaceutical takeovers and patents have had a huge influence on trying to drive out natural products. The alcohol prohibition, which occurred in the USA and in Norway and Sweden in the 1920s, was a result of powerful temperance movements. And it was designed to prevent the social damage that alcohol did to families, and it did that. But it actually, of course, led to a vast amount of social damage outside of families, i.e. the rise of organized crime and the mafia. And in the early 1920s, every single policeman in America was corrupted by the speakeasies, the underground bars. And so a separate army was created, the Untouchables, which became the Drug Enforcement Agency, led by this man, Harry Anslinger. And their job was to destroy alcohol. And they did. They destroyed a lot of it, but they didn't destroy the mafia. And in the end, the American populace said, we want alcohol and we don't like the crime. Well, they brought the alcohol back. Unfortunately, the crime stayed. But the problem was that rescinding the Prohibition law in 1932 faced Harry Anslinger with a major problem. How was he going to keep his job? And how were the 35,000 people who worked for him going to keep their jobs? So he created a new scare. Alcohol was okay, but marijuana was dangerous. The reason he called it marijuana, not cannabis, was to scare people about the fact it was being made in Mexico and brought across, and that Mexicans were coming, getting stoned and doing crazy, nasty things like dancing around fires, were corrupting young men and young women. And you can see, the classic profile of media hysteria around drugs, which involves semi-naked women and the idea that young white men are going to go mad. Very successful campaign. He kept his job, and the hysteria about cannabis and subsequent drugs has led to the DEA still existing in an enormous form in the States. And we now know that others have supported this disinformation campaign. The drinks industry in particular have been extremely effective in trying to persuade people that alcohol is not a drug. And we know that in the USA, where state votes take place to try to legalize cannabis, the drinks industry is particularly active in supporting the no legalization campaign. And I'll be very interested to see when New Zealand publishes its data on the sources of money for the no campaign. And I just wonder whether that very glossy anti-cannabis campaign that was run just up to your referendum, I wouldn't be surprised if some of it was funded by the drinks industry. It did seem to be remarkably well funded. And drugs, of course, have not always been a problem. The original war on drugs was actually the Second World War. Here's an advertisement for people to send to their loved ones who are fighting Benzodrine, amphetamine sulfate. And in fact, you can argue that amphetamine sulfate saved the free world because both the US and the British troops, the Allied troops, used amphetamine sulfate to keep going in times of great stress and a lack of sleep, whereas the Japanese and the Germans used the more powerful drug, which they thought was a better drug, called methamphetamine, but unfortunately its longer actions meant that they get chronic sleep deprivation, which probably led to an impairment of their function. So the war on drugs was won. The World War II was won on drugs, but then drugs became a problem because people were still using them, and it's only acceptable when you're fighting a war. And then the next war on drugs flipped it completely, and the war then became the war against people who use drugs. And this is a rather chilling statement that I think we all need to take note of. This is John Ehrlichman, one of the advisors to Richard Nixon. Nixon was losing the election. The war in Vietnam was going badly. He was in trouble. And as Ehrlichman said, we had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. I bet they thought about it, but they didn't. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Well, it worked. Nixon won every state except Maine because he created a fear of drugs that no rational American could not support him fighting against. So he came back into power, and we know what happened after that. But as Ehrlichman went on to say, well, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And all the governments in the world that slavishly follow the UN, which is essentially the USA position, and that includes New Zealand, you all know you are lying about the harms of the drugs that you put into Schedule 1. And the problem with lies are illustrated with these two excellent quotes. Charles Darwin: false facts are very injurious to science, for they endure long. And Mark Twain, getting more into the psychology of lying. How easy it is to make people believe a lie, and how hard it is to undo that. And we're living with that legacy. Still today, the vast majority of people think that drugs which are in Schedule 1, such as LSD and psilocybin and ayahuasca, must be addictive because they're in Schedule 1, even though they're actually anti-addictive. And of course, the problem with war is that when war comes, reason is regarded as treason. And that, of course, is why I was sacked. Well, that's the politics and the history. Let's look at the science. This is a rather famous meme now, which looks at the comparative harms of 20 different drugs, according to the drug science expert group, using a technique called multi-criteria decision analysis, developed by Larry Phillips here, and it's been a massively cited paper, over 1,300 citations, and it shows basically that alcohol is the most harmful drug overall in the UK because of the size of the red bar, and the red bar is the harms it does to other people. And it's not the most harmful drug to the user. Drugs like heroin and crystal and crack cocaine and crystal meth are more harmful to the user, but they're used a lot less. So this is a graph which I think should direct drug policy. And the problem is it doesn't. Here's the correlation between our scores and the UN conventions or the Misuse of Drugs Act, and you see there is no correlation. And that tells us that these laws are not based on science. Recently, we did a similar analysis in Australia, and alcohol still came out on top. So we're pretty confident that this technology is robust and valid, particularly in the Western countries. And I'm pleased to say there's been some progress. A couple of years ago, Drug Science advised the New Zealand Court of Appeal relating to methamphetamine penalties and the relationship of methamphetamine use, particularly in different areas of social strata and different ethnic groups. And the evidence of harms to the user was used to help revise these sentencing guidelines, which have made it much less likely, particularly that Maori people will go to prison for the possession of methamphetamine. So that's quite a significant impact that this kind of rational approach to drug use has had. We're also able to assess the impact of different forms of nicotine on people's harms. And here is the comparison of e-cigarettes or vaping with cigarettes. Green is the harm to the user, red is the harm to society. And e-cigarettes here came out at about 25 times less harmful overall than cigarettes. And this has been, this figure has been validated by other groups, and it's been used by Public Health England and also by the New Zealand Parliament to help set a new policy on nicotine products, which involves having as many people using e-cigarettes as possible. I mentioned earlier on about the Portugal experiment with the remarkable reduction in a remarkable revolutionary approach to drug use, particularly with opiate users being treated as human beings and having social and medical care rather than being put in prison. That experiment was put into place as a result of economic necessity. The prisons were filling up with people who were using drugs. And it was an extraordinary bold move. Now, 15 years on, we can look back and we can see it has dramatically improved the life of everyone in Portugal. And it's particularly improved the life of people who use opioids, because in Portugal, opioid deaths fell to 1/3 of what they were before the decriminalisation experiment. Whereas, as I showed you before, in Britain, they increased by 2/3 over the same time. And if you want to read about it, it's a free download on the Drug Science website from our journal, Drug Science, Policy and Law. When you start thinking about the harms of drugs, you can start thinking about alternatives. And I've already spoken about vaping and e-cigarettes for nicotine. But we've known now for 40 years that snus, safe oral tobacco from Sweden, has dramatically reduced lung cancer rates in Sweden, and now also it's doing the same in Norway, where it's legal. This is a very much safer way of taking tobacco than using a cigarette, which burns it. It's just put under your gum, the nicotine absorbs across the mucous membrane, and you get the kind of benefits of nicotine without massively reduced risks. In fact, there is no increased risk of health harms from snus at all, as far as we can see. And then there's alcohol. And some of you will know for a long time I've been trying to find ways to replace alcohol with less harmful alternatives. And here's a cover of New Scientist a few years ago, which addressed that from my work. And this is quite challenging, and we're still working on it, and we're hoping to release some drinks in the next few years. But I just discovered in recent years that the UK younger generation has got ahead of us. And this is recent data looking at the proportion of people in the different generations who are either low or no alcohol drinkers. Low means low, or usually that just means at weekends, or no means no. You see, 1/4 of millennials are now low or no in alcohol. And they're doing that largely for health reasons. Partly it's fashion, they don't want to be drunks like their parents, but it's also that they do care about their health. But that doesn't mean they don't use drugs. In fact, what's very interesting has been the rise of the use of nitrous oxide as an alternative to alcohol. Now, nitrous oxide is a gas that was invented a long time ago by, it was discovered in the UK by Priestley and Davy. And there's Humphrey Davy, the president of the Royal Society. And he was very fond of nitrous oxide because he could see that it had tremendous potential for exploring altered forms of consciousness. The poet Southey, when he took nitrous oxide, he gave it this beautiful description, the atmosphere of heaven. And if you want to read about the history of nitrous oxide, there's a book by Mike Jay as well worth reading. And then 80 years later, William James, the great American psychologist, used it and started to think about the nature of consciousness as a result of the perturbations that it produced in him, the pleasant perturbations, I should say. Of course, things have moved on a bit. Back in Victorian times, there were nitrous oxide parties. The gas was produced in a rather beautiful retort. Now it's in balloons from whippets, but the principle is the same. You have a short-lived intoxicating effect, which actually is not only pleasant and maybe even heavenly, but also remarkably safe and leads to very little in the way of longer-term consequences. So this is why British young people are using nitrous oxide, because the effects are strong and fast and pleasurable. The recovery is fast. The effect's over in minutes. So unlike with alcohol, where you can be vulnerable and when you're drunk for hours and have a hangover, which makes you dangerous for days, you can be back functioning within minutes after nitrous oxide if you just take one balloon. You can drive home safely. There's no hangover. There's less loss of work time, which I think is why the millennials are quite keen on it. And it's also why it's very popular with soccer players. Soccer players know they go to a party on a Saturday night and there's a match on a Sunday. If they get drunk, their performance will fall. But if they have a bag of nitrous, they can have a giggle with their friends and be perfectly able to play the next day. So maybe this is the future. Maybe this is one of the alternatives to alcohol. But of course, there's a lot more we should do. And from my perspective, these are the issues I think sensible governments, maybe New Zealand government would like to take on in the next few years. We should revise the UN conventions. We should reschedule all Schedule 1 drugs to allow researchers to use them so that they don't have to go through the bureaucracy that I had to when I wanted to work with psilocybin. It took me 2.5 years to get permissions to work with psilocybin. It still takes almost 18 months for each study I do just to get permissions. We should have drug testing like the Dutch do, which drug testing has virtually eliminated deaths from new psychoactive substances in the Netherlands. We need safe injecting rooms, and we need to massively roll out naloxone into the countries where there's an expansion of fentanyl, such as the USA and the UK. And we should regulate access to drugs less harmful than alcohol, because that is not only morally correct, but also will reduce the harms of alcohol and therefore reduce net harm overall. And some of you will perhaps know about this. You will know about Transform's recent book, How to Regulate Stimulants, a very sensible, considered, powerful suggestion that I fully endorse. And we should also push for political integrity. I have to say, one of the most remarkable things in Britain in relation to the election for the Conservative leader was the fact that Michael Gove got to the point of being a potential candidate, a man whose cocaine use was notorious, a man who himself said I could have gone to prison, but who still wants other people to go to prison, even though he'd like to be Prime Minister. And indeed, one day he might be. And it is absurd to live in a country where an admission that you had a lot of cocaine parties would debar you from being a teacher, but it won't stop you from being Prime Minister. It's truly a sign of ultimate hypocrisy. And finally, I want to talk about scientific integrity. And I'm going to suggest to you that the science of drug control is arguably the worst of all current science. And here are some examples in my lifetime. Denying the value of needle exchange, which led to the rise of AIDS. The US government refusing federal funds to research the seismic change in cannabis use. So 200 million Americans using medical cannabis and no federal funds to study what's going on. The false claims of MDMA brain toxicity. The FDA asserting that all vape products, even if just propylene glycol, is tobacco, even though there's no nicotine in them, simply so they can ban them. And the hysteria around the Valley outbreak of lung problems when people were vaping THC and vitamin E acetate, trying to blame vaping, ordinary tobacco and nicotine vaping for that. These are horrific examples of politically designed, science designed to appease political masters rather than tell the truth. And as I've said already, government refusals to fund research that might prove that their policies are wrong. And I will finish just by reminding you of perhaps what could be the underpinning principle of all international and national drug policies. This quote by John Stuart Mill: "In a freedom-loving society, no conduct by rational adults should be criminalized unless it's harmful to others." Well, thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting. I'm ready to take questions. I'll just flag up that my autobiography is coming out next month. If you're interested in reading more about my life and struggles and interests and relationships with politicians. Also, the new version of Drugs Out of Hot Air has come out, and all the proceeds for these books go to my charity, Drug Science. Thank you.